Welcome to the Windows Computer and Technology channel. And one of the things that people will talk about is how something bricked their PC, or bricking meaning it's rendered useless and there's nothing you can do. You got to buy a new one. So there's a lot of false information out there, and there's a lot of things that people share that, I upgraded to the new version of Windows and I got to buy a new PC now because it's broken. Windows broke my PC, or no, that does not happen, and this does not exist as a problem. Think of installing Windows as simply your computer working into installing an operating system. There's nothing about installing Windows that can break your PC in itself. Windows is a piece of software like any other software. It's what we call an operating system, so it's running your PC. But if your computer doesn't work, doesn't boot up, or whatever after a Windows, you install something else or you reinstall Windows and it's going to be fine. It doesn't break the PC. It's not true that a Windows update renders your PC useless and you got to buy a new one. It's not true moving from Windows 7 to 10 or 10 to 11 breaks your PC and you got to buy a new one. It doesn't happen like that. Now, a lot of those myths and a lot of those urban legends, I think, come from the fact that we will have from time to time, and it actually happened to me once, and you could have blamed Windows for that if you're not knowledgeable about how all hardware works and how Windows works. I remember in the good old days of Windows 98, installing Windows 98, and the hard drive died. So when it actually rebooted, the hard drive wasn't working anymore. So you might say, Windows broke my PC. It's, I got to change a part to buy a new PC. It's simply that you weren't lucky. The hard drive failed at that moment. And that's it. It's just, random problem that happened, and it kind of happened at the same time you were installing Windows. So it's easy to get in your head and make a deduction of, I was installing Windows, my hard drive broke down, so Windows might break my PC. No, it doesn't happen. This hardware failure happens, and it can happen at any times, but Windows does not create hardware failures. So in any way of installing Windows, even if you install it 100 times, you're not going to break your PC, and it's not going to be bricked to a point where you buy a new one. But there is something that can actually break a PC. And that is, and depends on the hardware and on the manufacturer, because some of the manufacturers have ways to still get hold of that hardware and have a reset that makes your PC boot up with minimal firmware. So you've heard of BIOS, you've heard of firmware updates. Modern PCs have UEFI firmwares. There's the old BIOS method where you would update the BIOS. And if some of you ever did that, you've probably noticed, do not shut down or cut the power while it's doing it. And it's written really, really in red letters, almost flashing red letters, because they want to make sure that you understand that is the worst time to do something like that. So that is a different story. Why? Because BIOS and UEFI firmware, what that has as a problem is that the firmware of your computer actually has the information for your computer's startup sequence and hardware, how it works. It is required. It has to work. It has to be there. Your BIOS software firmware needs to be in working shape in order for your PC to be able to do all the sequence needed to start up. No firmware, no UEFI, no BIOS, your PC is a useless device because it doesn't have the instructions and the know-how to perform the basic operations to start up. It doesn't know, the hardware doesn't know what to do. The updates, when you actually upgrade your firmware or your BIOS, that's where a glitch could brick your computer. When it's writing, if you would stop it right in the middle of that, chances are it broke the firmware or the BIOS. It just doesn't know what to do anymore because the software is broken. That case is in many cases a bricked computer, meaning it just doesn't have what it takes anymore to start. You can't reset it because the software is broken, and whatever you do, the motherboard is going to be useless in many cases. So that can happen. But there are a lot of motherboard manufacturers and a lot of manufacturers of hardware today that have fail-safe possibilities, meaning the BIOS is corrupt. You've got BIOS recovery possibilities. But that requires much more of a know-how on how to actually deal with it. But that would be the only way you could brick a PC. It would be to simply have corrupt firmware, UEFI firmware BIOS. This is why the stories we hear about, for example, viruses that would be able to write to the UEFI firmware of a PC is scary, because it could break your PC. It could do so many things. It could also render your PC kind of useless because the virus is always reinstalling because it's in the basic code of the computer itself. But that is a case where you could technically brick a PC, BIOS or firmware, incomplete updates or corrupt updates. That's why never turn it off when you do a firmware update. Even if it takes a long time, leave it alone. Do what it has to do. It will complete and it will restart. If you enjoy my videos, please subscribe, give us thumbs up. Thank you for watching.